Hello and welcome to my video on voting systems. This is for GCSE citizenship studies. It's for the AQA specification, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter. Okay, so the video, as I mentioned, is about the topic of voting systems. I know that this is not the most exciting YouTube video you have ever seen, but I guess you're here for the revision rather than anything else. It is something you need to get your head around, and I am going to use the 2019 election to illustrate how this works. Now, the system I'm going to talk about is the first past the post system, otherwise known as FPTP. It's basically used in UK general elections and English local elections. There are other voting systems in use around the UK, and I'm going to touch on those very briefly. Okay. So, the first thing I'm going to say is that there are 650 MPs in the UK Parliament. Each of those represents a constituency, and each of them is voted into power using a system called first past the post. Now, I'm going to introduce you to an MP. This MP happens to be a local MP. His name is Mark Pawsey. Basically, he's a Conservative MP, and at the last election, he received 29,000 votes. Now, the person who came second, Debbie Bannigan, who was a Labour candidate, received 15,000 votes. Now, this seems fairly simple. Basically, Mark Pawsey got more votes, and so he won. Simple. There's nothing very difficult about that kind of scenario. But we'll have a look at that in a little more detail. Okay, so it seems reasonably fair that Mark Pawsey won, and overall he got 57% of the votes that were made. However, what we're going to do is we'll have a look at another MP, and this time it's an MP called Olivia Blake. She represents an area of the country or a constituency called Sheffield Hallam. At the last election, she received 19,709 votes. The second place candidate received 18,997. So she won by, 712 votes? The third place candidate received 14,696 votes. So why does that matter? In simple terms, she got more votes than the second place candidate, so she deserves to be the winner. Or does she? Because there's a problem with this. In short, more people voted against Olivia Blake than voted for her. In her constituency, she only received the support of 34.6% of the votes. Now, that might not seem fair. Basically, more people voted against her than for her, which is in contrast to what happened to Mark Pawsey. Now, Olivia Blake is probably going to argue that it's not her fault that people voted for different parties and that she benefited from what's known as a split in the vote. However, she is one of 229 MPs who got less than 50% of the votes in their particular constituency. Now, again, it might be argued, so what? Well, one of the things we might argue is that MPs should represent the majority of their constituents. In essence, how can Olivia Blake effectively represent a community where 65% of the people didn't want her to be the MP in the first place? In short, first past the post system doesn't seem to reflect the wishes of people, particularly well. And we can have a look at another example of this. Because the way the system works, basically the losing parties in each constituency are ignored. But if you were to kind of count their vote up and put that in a kind of one big basket, you get some strange results. If you created MPs, for example, by the proportion of votes each party received, the Conservative Party would have 280 MPs, not 364. And the big winner from using this kind of system would be the Liberal Democrats. They would end up with 75 MPs, whereas at the moment they've only got 11. In contrast, the Scottish National Party would lose 23 seats. So that would have a big impact if we change the voting system. And this change would be called what's known as proportional representation. So, one thing that we might conclude is why not change the system? Well, we've already had a referendum on that, and it was decided that the first past the post system was the system we wanted to stick with. The other thing to say is that other systems are also used in regional and local elections, um, but these systems, things like proportional representation or single transferable votes, are often seen as one, quite complicated, two, they don't result in clear election victories. It often leads to coalitions of parties, but it does result in a better representation of people's views. So, although the first past the post system might not be the fairest, it is simple to understand and generally delivers decisive results, including things like parliamentary majorities. And people kind of like that. They like to know who has won, not wait for parties to come along and sort of agree with one another in order to form a government. So, although there are problems with first past the post, it seems to be the system that we're going to continue with, uh, at least in the medium term.